The office smelled of wet wool and tobacco. Colonel Arne Sivo sat at his desk in the basement of the General Headquarters building in Mikkeli, staring at a map that had become his entire world. Outside, the Finnish winter had arrived early, brutal and unforgiving. Inside, the air was thick with the kind of silence that comes before irreversible decisions. It was December 6, 1939. Finland's Independence Day. 7 days into a war that was supposed to last a week, maybe 2 if the Soviets were stubborn. That's what the optimists had said. That's what Sivo himself had believed, in the brief, naive hours before the first Soviet shell crossed the border. Now, a week later, the map told a different story. Red marks, Soviet divisions, pressed against every major road leading south from the Karelian Isthmus. Blue marks, Finnish battalions, undermanned, under-equipped, held positions that were supposed to be temporary. Sivo had drawn those blue marks himself. He knew how thin they were. He knew what they represented: farmers, teachers, clerks. Men who had been given rifles and told to hold the line until diplomacy worked. Until the League of Nations intervened. Until someone, anyone, stopped this. But no one was coming. Sivo's hand hovered over the map, tracing the line of the Mannerheim fortifications. They were holding. Barely. Reports came in every few hours, ammunition running low, casualties mounting, temperatures dropping to -30. The Soviets kept coming. Wave after wave. They didn't care about losses. They had men to spare. Finland did not. The door opened. Major Lauri Tanner stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the concrete floor. He didn't salute. There was no time for formality anymore. He simply placed a folder on Sivo's desk and said, "The latest from Suomi." Sivo opened it. His eyes scanned the report. The 163rd Soviet Division had pushed deeper into the forest roads north of Lake Ladoga. Finnish forces, barely a regiment, were attempting to slow them down. The Soviets had tanks, artillery, thousands of men. The Finns had ski troops and hunting rifles. "They're asking for reinforcements," Tanner said quietly. Sivo didn't look up. "We don't have reinforcements." "I know." Silence settled between them. Outside, the muffled sound of a truck engine starting. Somewhere in the building, a radio crackled with static. Sivo closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. "How long do you think we can hold?" Tanner asked. Sivo didn't answer immediately. He looked at the map again. At the red marks that kept multiplying. At the blue marks that kept shrinking. "As long as we have to," he said finally. It was the answer of a soldier. Not the answer of a man who believed it. The days that followed blurred together. December 7th, 8th, 9th. Each morning, Sivo woke to new reports. Each night, he went to sleep with the same question gnawing at him: how much longer? The Soviets had expected to march into Helsinki within 2 weeks. They had printed maps with new borders. They had prepared victory parades. But the Finns refused to collapse. They fought in the forests, in the snow, in the dark. They used the terrain like a weapon. They moved at night, struck at dawn, disappeared before the Soviets could retaliate. But it wasn't enough. Sivo knew the numbers. He had memorized them. Finland had 300,000 men under arms. The Soviet Union had mobilized over 1 million. Finland had 100 tanks. The Soviets had thousands. Finland had 114 aircraft. The Soviets had over 3,000. The math was simple. Brutal. Inevitable. And yet, the men kept fighting. On December 12th, Sivo received a letter from his wife. It had taken 5 days to reach him. She wrote about their daughter, about the evacuation of civilians from the eastern towns, about the women who had started sewing uniforms in the church basement. She didn't ask when he would come home. She knew better. At the end of the letter, she had written, We believe in you. All of Finland believes in you. Sivo folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. He didn't cry. He couldn't afford to. But something inside him shifted. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying grew heavier. Belief was a dangerous thing. It demanded results. It demanded miracles. And Sivo had none to give. On December 17th, the temperature dropped to -35. The cold was so severe that Soviet tanks wouldn't start. Rifle bolts froze. Men died in their sleep, their bodies found stiff and blue in the morning. The Finns, born into this cold, adapted. They wore white camouflage. They moved on skis. They became ghosts in the forest, striking and vanishing before the Soviets even knew they were there. But adaptation wasn't victory. It was survival. Sivo stood in the operations room, watching as officers moved markers across the map. The Soviets had launched a new offensive on the Karelheimi front. 12 divisions. Artillery barrages that lasted hours. The Finnish lines bent but didn't break. How long can they hold? Someone asked. No one answered. Sivo walked to the window. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains. Somewhere out there, men were dying. Finnish men. Boys, really. 18, 19 years old. They were dying in the snow, far from home, believing that their sacrifice mattered. And maybe it did. Maybe holding the line for one more day, one more hour, was enough. Maybe the world was watching. Maybe help was coming. Or maybe they were alone. Sivo pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He closed his eyes. And for the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to think the thought he had been avoiding. This is not going to be short. The calendar on Sivo's desk read December 22nd. 3 days until Christmas. 16 days into the war. The numbers had stopped meaning anything. Days were measured not in hours but in reports. In casualties. In the shrinking blue marks on the map. Sivo had stopped sleeping in his quarters. He slept at his desk now, when he slept at all. His uniform hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight. They all had. Food was rationed. Coffee was weak. But no one complained. Complaining required energy they didn't have. Major Tanner entered the room without knocking. He had stopped knocking days ago. He carried a stack of reports, thicker than usual. He set them down carefully, as if they were fragile. Talvajarvi, he said simply. Sivo looked up. Talvajarvi. A small village near the eastern border. Strategic only because a road ran through it. The Soviets had been pushing there for days, trying to cut Finnish supply lines. A single regiment, barely 4,000 men, had been holding them off. What happened? They held, Tanner said. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. The 139th Soviet Division pulled back. Heavy losses. Sivo stared at him. They held? Yes, sir. For a moment, neither man spoke. A victory. A real, tangible victory. The kind that could be written in dispatches, broadcast on the radio, celebrated. The kind that proved the impossible was possible. But Sivo didn't smile. He opened the report and read the numbers. Finnish casualties, 630 dead, over 1,200 wounded. Soviet casualties, estimated 5,000. The Soviets could replace those men. Finland could not. How many reinforcements can we send them? Sivo asked. Tanner hesitated. None. None? We're stretched too thin. Every available unit is committed. If we pull men from one sector, another collapses. Sivo closed the report. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked, water-stained. He had stared at those cracks so many times he had memorized their patterns. Then we tell them to hold, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Tanner left. The door closed. Sivo was alone again. He picked up a pencil and began writing a letter. Not to his wife. Not to his daughter. To the commander at Talvajarvi. Colonel Paavo Talvala. A man he had never met but whose name appeared in every report. A man who had done the impossible. Your men have given Finland hope, Sivo wrote. Hold as long as you can. We are doing everything we can to support you. It was a lie. A necessary lie. There was no support coming. No reinforcements. No supplies. Just words on paper. Sivo sealed the letter and handed it to a courier. Then he returned to the map. Christmas came and went. There were no celebrations. No songs. In the trenches, men shared what little food they had. Some prayed. Others smoked in silence. A few wrote letters they knew might never be sent. In Mikkeli, Sivo worked through the night. The reports kept coming. The Soviets had launched a new offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. 30 divisions. Artillery fire so intense it could be heard from miles away. The Finnish lines buckled. Positions that had held for weeks were abandoned. Retreat was no longer a possibility, it was a necessity. On December 28, Sivo received a telegram from Marshal Mannerheim himself. It was brief. Direct. Assess our capacity to sustain current defensive operations through January. Report by 0600. Sivo read it 3 times. Then he sat down and began calculating. Ammunition reserves, critically low. Artillery shells, rationed to 10 per gun per day. Rifles, 1 for every 2 men in some units. Winter clothing, insufficient. Medical supplies, nearly exhausted. Fuel, enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3. And men. Always men. The casualty lists grew longer every day. 2,000 dead. 5,000 wounded. 500 missing. And for every man lost, there was no replacement. The reserves had been called up weeks ago. Boys as young as 16 were being handed rifles and sent to the front. Sivo finished his calculations and stared at the numbers. They told a story he didn't want to believe. A story that ended badly. He picked up his pen and began writing his report. He chose his words carefully. He couldn't afford to sound defeatist. But he couldn't lie either. Mannerheim needed the truth. Current defensive operations can be sustained through mid-January, provided no major Soviet breakthroughs occur. Beyond that, our capacity to resist will depend on factors outside our control, foreign aid, diplomatic intervention, or a fundamental shift in Soviet strategy. He paused. Then he added one final sentence. We are fighting a war we cannot win. But we can make them pay for every meter. He sealed the report and sent it. Then he sat in the silence, waiting for a response that might never come. The new year arrived. 1940, January 1st, 23 days into the war. Sivo marked the date on his calendar with a single stroke of his pen. Another day. Another battle. Another report. The Soviets had regrouped. They were preparing for a massive offensive. Intelligence reports confirmed it. Hundreds of thousands of men. Thousands of tanks. A coordinated assault designed to shatter the Finnish defenses once and for all. Sivo knew what was coming. Everyone did. The only question was when. On January 3rd, he received new orders from Mannerheim. They were simple. Blunt. Hold the line. No retreat. No surrender. Sivo read the orders aloud to his staff. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They all understood what it meant. They would fight. They would die. And maybe, just maybe, they would buy Finland enough time for a miracle. But Sivo no longer believed in miracles. That night, Sivo sat alone in his office. The building was quiet. Most of the staff had gone to sleep. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The cold seeped through the walls, through his uniform, into his bones. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the letter from his wife. He had read it so many times the paper was soft, worn at the folds. He read it again. "We believe in you. All of Finland believes in you." Sivo folded the letter and placed it back in his pocket. He stood and walked to the map. The red marks had multiplied. The blue marks had shrunk. The line was thinner than ever. He placed his hand on the map, his fingers resting on the Karelian Isthmus. Somewhere out there, men were waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for hope. Waiting for someone to tell them it would be okay. But Sivo had no hope to give. He had only the truth. And the truth was this: the war would not be short. It would not be easy. It would not end the way anyone had imagined. But it would be fought. To the last man. To the last bullet. To the last breath. Sivo closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. And in that moment, in the silence between reports, he understood. This was no longer about victory. It was about endurance. About proving that a small nation could stand against an empire. About showing the world that some things were worth dying for. He opened his eyes. The map was still there. The red marks. The blue marks. The thin, fragile line. And Sivo knew, with absolute certainty, that the line would hold. Not because it was strong, but because it had to. January 7th, 1940. 28 days into the war. For weeks that felt like years. Sivo stood in the operations room, surrounded by men who looked like ghosts. Hollow eyes. Unshaven faces. Uniforms that hung on frames too thin. They had all stopped pretending. The optimism that had carried them through the first week was gone. The hope that had sustained them through the second was dead. What remained was something harder. Something colder. Duty. The morning briefing had just ended. The news was grim, as always. The Soviets had launched their offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. Exactly as predicted. 27 divisions. Over 300,000 men. Artillery barges that turned the frozen earth into a moonscape. The Finnish lines were holding, but barely. Casualties were catastrophic. Major Tanner approached Sivo with a telegram. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it over. Sivo noticed. Tanner never trembled. "From Suomussalmi," Tanner said quietly. Sivo opened it. "Read it once. Then again." His expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. The telegram was from Colonel Jalmar Salasvuo. His forces, outnumbered 5-1, had encircled and destroyed the Soviet 44th Division. Thousands of enemy soldiers killed or captured. Tanks abandoned. Supply columns obliterated. A complete, devastating victory. Sivo looked up. "Is this confirmed?" "Yes, sir. Multiple sources." For a long moment, Sivo said nothing. He stared at the telegram, at the words that seemed impossible. Another victory. Another miracle. The kind of victory that would be studied in military academies for generations. But Sivo felt no joy. Only a deep, bone-tired certainty. "How many men did we lose?" he asked. Tanner consulted his notes. "Approximately 900 dead. 1,700 wounded." Sivo nodded slowly. He walked to the map and found Suomussalmi. A small blue mark in a sea of red. He stared at it for a long time. "We're winning battles," he said quietly. "But we're losing the war." Tanner didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They both knew it was true. The days that followed were a blur of reports, orders, calculations. The Soviets kept coming. The Finns kept fighting. The line kept holding. But the cost was unbearable. By mid-January, Finnish casualties had exceeded 15,000. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Villages had been evacuated. Hospitals were overflowing. And still, no help came. The League of Nations issued statements. Foreign governments expressed sympathy. But no one sent troops. No one sent weapons. No one intervened. Finland was alone. On January 17th, Sivo received a summons. Marshal Mannerheim wanted to see him. Immediately. Sivo arrived at Mannerheim's office just after dawn. The old marshal sat behind his desk, a map spread before him. He looked older than Sivo remembered. Tired. But his eyes were sharp, clear. "Sit," Mannerheim said. Sivo sat. Mannerheim studied him for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I've read your reports. All of them. You've been honest. Brutally honest. I appreciate that." Sivo said nothing. "I'm going to be equally honest with you," Mannerheim continued. "We cannot win this war. Not in any conventional sense. The Soviets have too many men, too many tanks, too many resources. If they are willing to pay the price, they will eventually break through." Sivo felt something tighten in his chest. Hearing it spoken aloud, by Mannerheim himself, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "But," Mannerheim said, leaning forward, "we can make the price so high that they will negotiate. We can make them bleed for every kilometer. We can show them that conquering Finland will cost more than it's worth." He paused. His eyes locked onto Sivo's. "That is our strategy now. Not victory. Survival. Long enough to force them to the negotiating table." Sivo absorbed the words. He had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed was different. It meant accepting a new reality. A reality where thousands of men would die not to win, but simply to delay the inevitable. "How long?" Sivo asked. "As long as it takes," Mannerheim said. "Weeks. Months. However long we can hold." Sivo nodded. He understood. And in that understanding, something inside him settled. The uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks, the gnawing question of how long, was answered. As long as it takes. It wasn't hope. It wasn't optimism. It was something simpler. Clearer. Certainty. Sivo returned to his office and sat at his desk. The map was still there. The red marks. The blue marks. The thin, fragile line. But he saw it differently now. He saw it not as a line that was failing, but as a line that was holding. Against impossible odds. Against an enemy that should have crushed them in days. The line was still there. Battered. Bleeding. But unbroken. He picked up his pen and began writing orders. Not orders of retreat. Not orders of surrender. Orders to hold. To fight. To endure. He wrote to the commanders at Suma, at Taipei, at Kala. He wrote to men he had never met, men who were dying in the snow, men who deserved to know that their sacrifice mattered. Hold the line, he wrote. Not because victory is certain, but because Finland is watching. The world is watching. And history will remember. He sealed the orders and sent them. Then he sat back and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind howled. The cold pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. And Sivo felt, for the first time in weeks, a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of victory. Not the peace of safety. But the peace that comes from knowing exactly what must be done, and accepting the cost. On January 27th, 50 days into the war, Sivo stood at the window of his office and watched the snow fall. It fell silently, endlessly, covering the world in white. A courier arrived with the latest casualty reports. Sivo took them without looking. He already knew what they would say. More dead. More wounded. More names added to a list that grew longer every day. But the line was still holding. Major Tanner entered the room. He looked exhausted, but there was something different in his expression. Something that hadn't been there before. "Sir," he said. "I just received word from the front. The men, they're asking when reinforcements will arrive." Sivo turned from the window. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth. That there are no reinforcements. That they're all we have." "And?" Tanner hesitated. Then he said, "They said they'll hold anyway." Sivo felt something catch in his throat. He nodded slowly. "Of course they will," he said quietly. Tanner left. Sivo returned to the window. He watched the snow fall and thought about the men in the trenches. The men in the forests. The men who were cold, hungry, exhausted, and still fighting. They weren't fighting because they believed they would win. They were fighting because they had no other choice. Because surrender was unthinkable. Because some things were worth more than life itself. And in that moment, Sivo understood something he hadn't understood before. The war would not be short. It would not be easy. It would not end the way anyone had hoped. But it would be fought. To the last man. To the last bullet. To the last breath. Not because Finland could win. But because Finland refused to lose. Sivo sat down at his desk. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. Not a report. Not an order. A letter. To his wife. "The war will not be short," he wrote. "But we will endure. Not because we are strong. But because we have no other choice. Tell our daughter that her father fought for something that mattered. Tell her that some things are worth any price." He signed the letter and sealed it. He placed it in his breast pocket, next to the letter she had sent him weeks ago. Then he stood and walked to the map one last time. The red marks were still there. The blue marks were still there. The line was still there. Thin. Fragile. Unbroken. Sivo placed his hand on the map, his fingers resting on the Karelian Isthmus. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the line would hold. Not forever. But long enough. Long enough for the world to see. Long enough for history to remember. Long enough for Finland to prove that a small nation could stand against an empire and refuse to bend. The equation of the war had changed. Not in victory. Not in defeat. But in something deeper. In the certainty that some battles are worth fighting, even when you cannot win.